Richard Green was an old black man who had sacrificed everything to raise two abandoned children he once found crying in a dark alley. They were homeless, cold, and forgotten by the world. But Richard gave them his last piece of bread, his last ounce of strength, and the love of a father they never knew. Decades later, after giving his life to kindness and hard work, Richard's cruel boss framed him for a crime he did not commit. The courtroom turned against him. People spat names at him: thief, liar, fraud. His dignity was shredded in front of the world. But when the world abandoned Richard, the two children he had once saved walked into that courtroom, no longer children, but strong men and women of character. They stood up, not as strangers, but as his family, and they were determined to fight for his justice, no matter the cost. This is the story of betrayal, sacrifice, and redemption. The story of a man who gave everything, and how the children he raised became the ones to save him. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that will touch your soul and remind you that kindness never dies. Hit the like button if you believe love and sacrifice will always outlive hate. Comment, "Justice will prevail," if you're watching till the end. Now let's dive into Richard's unforgettable journey. Richard Green's story began long before the courtroom, long before the world turned its back on him. He was a man shaped by hardship, carrying the weight of loneliness and years of unspoken struggles. His face bore the lines of countless sacrifices, his hands hardened by labor that had kept him alive but never lifted him out of poverty. On nights when most of the city slept, Richard was awake, scrubbing floors in dimly lit offices, his knees aching from bending, his back screaming under the strain of mops and buckets. Each shift left him weary, but he never allowed his spirit to completely break. He was a man who clung to dignity like a shield, even when life stripped away everything else. It was one such night that changed everything. The air was biting cold, the streets nearly deserted, and Richard was making his way home on foot, his coat too thin to shield him from the sharp wind. He walked past alleys he had seen 100 times before, narrow spaces filled with shadows and silence. But on this night, something made him stop. From the darkness came a sound, soft at first, then sharper, the desperate cry of children. Richard paused, uncertain if fatigue was playing tricks on him. But as he leaned closer, he saw them, two small figures huddled together near a pile of trash, their bodies trembling from cold, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. A boy, no older than 10, and a little girl, barely 6. Their clothes were thin, torn, unfit for the winter chill. The boy held the girl tightly, whispering words of comfort that sounded more like broken prayers. Richard's heart clenched. He had seen suffering before, but never like this. Something in their eyes, wide, hollow, pleading, reached into him deeper than hunger or exhaustion ever had. He looked around, hoping someone else would step forward, but the streets remained empty. It was just him, a tired old man with little more than a half-eaten loaf of bread in his pocket. He hesitated. His own cupboards were nearly bare. Every cent he earned was already promised to rent, to bills, to survival. Taking in these children could crush him completely. Yet as he stood there watching them shiver and cling to one another, he knew the truth. Walking away would destroy something greater than his finances. It would break his humanity. With a slow breath, Richard crouched beside them, his voice gentle, though his heart was heavy. The children flinched at first, afraid, but he offered them the bread from his pocket. Their small hands reached out, trembling as they tore into it with the desperation of starvation. The boy looked up at him, eyes filled with both fear and hope, as if silently asking, "Will you leave us here?" Richard's throat tightened. He couldn't, not tonight, not ever. He gathered them to their feet, his old hands steadying their fragile frames. The girl clung to his sleeve as though she sensed safety for the first time in years. Richard led them home, every step weighted with uncertainty. His small apartment was barely enough for one, but that night it became a sanctuary. He spread out his thin blanket on the floor, tucked them in, and stayed awake to watch over them, The responsibility he had just claimed pressed down on him like an iron chain, but strangely, for the first time in years, his soul felt alive. By morning, word had already begun to spread. Neighbors whispered, some with pity, others with ridicule. A black man taking in white children? He'll regret it. He can't even feed himself. What's he doing with them? Their voices carried judgment sharp enough to wound, but Richard kept his head high. Let them talk. These children had been left to die in an alley, and now they had a chance to live. In the days that followed, Richard gave them everything he had. His meals grew smaller because theirs grew larger. His shifts multiplied while his sleep disappeared. Each morning he would send them off to school with lunches pieced together from scraps, and each night he would endure the ache of exhaustion in silence. Every sacrifice etched deeper lines into his face, but every smile from those children reminded him why he endured it. The boy who once cowered in the shadows began to laugh again. The girl who once cried herself to sleep learned to dream. Richard saw life returning to their eyes, and though he was weary beyond measure, he felt a pride that no paycheck could ever give. He was not just surviving anymore. He was saving lives. But still, the shadows of doubt never fully disappeared. The world outside was cruel. Suspicion followed him wherever he went. People questioned his motives, some even accusing him of trying to gain something by raising 2 abandoned white children. Yet Richard endured the whispers and the stares. He didn't care about the world's approval. All that mattered was the bond that was growing inside his tiny apartment, an unbreakable thread of love forged in the fire of hardship. Richard Green had nothing when he found those children, but in saving them, he discovered something greater than wealth, greater than comfort. He had found a reason to fight, a reason to keep living, even when the world insisted he should give up. And though he didn't know it yet, those children would one day return the sacrifice. Morning in the small apartment arrived, like a promise Richard refused to break. The kettle rattled on a tired stove, steam fogging the narrow window while he laid out 2 bowls as if setting a table for royalty. The boy folded the threadbare blanket with careful precision. The girl brushed crumbs from the floor with a hand broom too large for her wrist. They were learning routine, learning safety, learning that a day could begin without fear. When they left for school, their backpacks looked heavier than their bodies, yet they walked a little taller each week, as if the hallway itself were cheering them onward. Winter bit hard that first year. Richard patched sleeves with fabric from old shirts, turned socks into mittens, and learned the science of warmth from nothing. Newspaper in shoe soles, towels warmed over the radiator, a choreographed dance of closing drafts. The children came home red-cheeked and bright-eyed, dropping stories like birds into his open hands. He tucked their homework under a chipped mug so wind wouldn't steal it from the sill, and he praised every careful letter, every figured sum, as if each one stitched another stitch into their future. Work multiplied because love demanded it. He scrubbed empty offices under fluorescent moons, stacked boxes at dawn in a warehouse that smelled of dust and engine oil, and caught broken hours of sleep on buses that rocked like tired cradles. His hands thickened, knuckles flaring with ache, but his grip on purpose never loosened. Exhaustion pressed him flat. Gratitude raised him again. He measured his day not by wages, but by the way the children's shoulders relaxed when they saw him at the door. Suspicion arrived in a neat coat with a clipboard. A social worker, polite but alert, stepped over the threshold and scanned the room for proof of failure. Richard had nothing elegant to show, only a rinsed sink, a short stack of canned soup, shoes lined like soldiers, and drawings tacked to the wall. Crooked suns, paper trees, a figure with graying hair, and a gentle smile. The inspection ended with notes, then silence. The silence felt like a verdict delayed, and Richard endured it the way he endured winter, by moving forward anyway. When an eviction notice flashed pink against the doorframe, panic fluttered in the room like a trapped moth. He carried his last good thing, a music player from quieter years, down to a pawn shop where memories fetched a small, necessary sum. The notice disappeared, the roof held. He returned home lighter in one way and heavier in another. Illness tested them next. The girl burned with fever. her breath quick and fragile. Richard wrapped her in layered blankets and held her through the dark, counting heartbeats like prayer beads. At the free clinic, he waited under humming lights while she slept against his chest and the boy leaned on his arm, brave and silent. Medicine was placed in his palm like mercy. He carried it home as if it were gold. Neighbors watched. Some offered sharp glances that said he had no right. Others slid kindness across the threshold in small bowls of soup. He accepted both the way he accepted weather, refusing to let either define the house he was building with patience and bread. The children lengthened in spirit before they did in height. The boy sketched blueprints of imaginary houses where no one was cold. The girl devoured library books and read aloud with the fierce steadiness of someone learning how to be unafraid. They learned to rinse dishes, fold laundry, and leave notes on the table that said they had tried their best. At the warehouse, a foreman with a polished name and a narrow smile noticed Richard's reliability and waited like a tool he might one day misuse. Richard kept his eyes on the work, stacking, lifting, enduring, the way he always had. Every paycheck became pencils, bus fare, second-hand shoes, and double portions on the nights the children needed to feel abundance. Love turned becomes ritual, ritual turns into strength. By the time spring crept back under the door, the apartment carried the scent of soap and oatmeal and sharpened pencils, and the air itself felt sturdier. Richard studied their sleeping faces and saw not charity, but destiny under construction. He did not know what storms stood beyond the horizon, but he trusted the small certainties he could hold: warm bowls, finished homework, worn hands that kept opening. In that quiet, he understood that survival was no longer the end goal. He was raising courage, and courage, once taught to stand, would one day learn how to protect. Years rolled forward, carrying the children into young adulthood and Richard deeper into the grind of survival. His back stooped more each year, his hair thinned into patches of gray, and yet he never allowed his exhaustion to turn into bitterness. He worked long hours at the warehouse, where the air was thick with dust and the echo of machinery, and where loyalty was paid back with little more than a paycheck that barely covered rent. Still, Richard carried himself with quiet dignity, the same way he had on the night he first brought the children home. It was there, in that warehouse, that betrayal first began to take root. His boss, a man named Carlson, wore expensive suits and a smile that never touched his eyes. He saw in Richard not a worker, but a tool, reliable, compliant, too humble to fight back. For years, Carlson leaned on Richard's dedication, piling extra shifts on his shoulders, knowing he would never refuse. Richard endured it all, believing hard work was a shield against the cruelty of the world. But Carlson had no respect for shields, only for power. One evening, after weeks of missing hours with the children and pushing through pain that gnawed at his knees, Richard returned home to find two officers waiting at his door. Their presence cast a shadow longer than the hallway itself. They carried papers, cold and unyielding, accusing him of theft from the very warehouse he had poured his life into. Boxes of missing goods, falsified ledgers, whispers of dishonesty. Every arrow was pointed directly at him. The neighbors who once whispered suspicion now spoke it aloud. "We always knew he was hiding something. He took those kids for sympathy, now look." Their words cut deeper than any blade. The children, nearly grown, stood by him with wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Richard tried to reassure them, but inside, a storm brewed. He had given everything, every ounce of strength, every hour of his life, and now the system he trusted had turned him into a criminal. The trial was swift, too swift for truth to find a foothold. Prosecutors painted him as a man who had always lived behind a mask of generosity, a liar who used his story as a cover for greed. The courtroom became a theater of humiliation. Spectators sneered as he was led in wearing chains, their stares heavy with contempt. His voice, when he spoke, trembled not from guilt but from disbelief. The evidence was fabricated, yet so convincing that even the judge's gaze carried doubt. Each witness called by Carlson twisted words into daggers. Men Richard had worked beside claimed they had seen him sneaking near shipments. Documents appeared with his forged signature. Every time Richard tried to speak, the gavel struck him silent, drowning out truth with authority. He sat at the defendant's table, shoulders sagging, listening as his life was dismantled piece by piece. The children sat in the back row, their faces pale, their hands clenched together. They had known Richard's sacrifices, his hunger so they could eat, his weariness so they could rest. To see him branded a thief was more than injustice. It was an attack on the very foundation of their lives. But they were young, powerless, unprepared for the machinery of a courtroom designed to crush men like Richard. When the sentence was pronounced, the air turned colder than winter. A life behind bars. A life stripped of freedom, dignity, and the small joys he had fought to protect. Richard's head bowed, not in guilt, but in the heavy sorrow of a man betrayed by the very principles he had believed in. He had taught the children that honesty and sacrifice would shield them from the cruelty of the world. Now, with iron chains biting into his wrists, he wondered if those lessons had been lies. Yet deep in his chest, beneath the ache of despair, a fragile hope refused to die. He looked once more at the children, his children, and though their faces blurred through the haze of tears, he saw something stirring in their eyes. A fire he had never seen before. It was the same fire he had carried into that alley years ago, the same defiance that had pushed him to choose love when the world demanded indifference. Richard didn't know how or when, but in that moment he realized the story wasn't finished. They would not let him fall alone. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and cold stone, a place where justice was supposed to live, but where Richard felt only betrayal. Days turned into weeks as the trial dragged on, and each morning he was led through those heavy doors and chains that clinked like accusations. His once straight back bent under the weight of humiliation. Prosecutors spun lies into golden threads that seemed impossible to unravel, while Carlson, his former boss, sat smugly at the witness stand, every word he spoke dripping with poison. Spectators filled the benches, many of them eager to see the downfall of a man they once praised for his selflessness. Murmurs rippled through the crowd each time Richard's name was mentioned, words like fraud and thief floating on the stale air. The judge listened with a hardened face, his gavel silencing every attempt Richard made to defend himself. Documents were produced, false witnesses paraded, and the picture painted was of a man who had stolen, deceived, and hidden behind the guise of generosity for years. Richard's hands clenched on the table before him, the chains at his wrists digging into his skin until blood welled in tiny lines. The children sat quietly at the back, their hearts breaking with every blow delivered against him. They were no longer the trembling figures he had lifted from the alley years before. They were grown now, shaped by the love and discipline he had poured into them, and their silence masked the storm gathering in their chests. They had spent sleepless nights collecting every scrap of truth they could find, every shred of evidence that could clear his name. They refused to let the man who had given them life be buried by lies. On the day Carlson delivered his final testimony, the atmosphere was suffocating. He spoke with confidence, weaving a narrative of stolen goods and misplaced trust, his voice loud enough to fill every corner of the room. Richard sat still, staring at the floor, too weary to look up. For a moment it seemed that justice itself had died in that courtroom. But then the doors creaked open. Two figures stepped forward. The children, now adults, walked with a steadiness that silenced the room. Their eyes, once filled with fear, now burned with determination. Gasps spread across the benches as they made their way to the front, their presence a living contradiction to every accusation that had been hurled against Richard. The boy, now a man, laid down files thick with records, ledgers that proved Carlson had orchestrated the thefts himself, signatures that revealed forgery, testimonies from co-workers who had been too afraid to speak until now. The girl, now a woman, raised her voice with trembling strength, recounting the nights Richard went without food so they could eat, the mornings he left before dawn to work 3 jobs, the evenings he returned home with calloused hands and a heart still full of patience. Her words painted a picture no lie could erase. The judge leaned forward, the first flicker of doubt crossing his stern face. Carlson shifted in his seat, his composure cracking as questions turned back toward him. The courtroom, once hostile, now buzzed with unease. The spectators who had mocked Richard fell into silence, their whispers dying under the weight of truth being laid bare. Richard lifted his head slowly, his tired eyes resting on the children who stood like pillars before him. Pride and disbelief collided in his chest. He had once thought his sacrifices might fade into nothing, forgotten in the world's cruelty. But here they were, the children he had rescued from the cold, now standing in the light, fighting with a courage that mirrored his own. For the first time since the trial began, hope entered the room. Not loud or triumphant, but steady, unyielding, the kind of hope that promised the storm was about to break. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with tension as the judge sifted through the evidence placed before him. Each page turned sounded louder than the clank of Richard's chains. Carlson sat rigid, his smug expression melting into unease as his lies unraveled under the light of truth. The documents bore his own signature. The ledgers revealed gaps too large to dismiss, and the testimony of the grown children, now witnesses of unshakable credibility, cut through the fog of deceit like a blade. The courtroom that once looked at Richard with contempt now shifted uneasily, shame creeping across faces that had been quick to judge. Richard sat, motionless, afraid to believe, afraid to hope, but unable to look away. For months, his world had been a blur of accusation and despair. Now, before his weary eyes, the tide was turning. The prosecutor stammered, fumbling over words that no longer carried weight. The defense Carlson had built crumbled with each passing second, collapsing under the weight of truth. When Carlson was finally called back to the stand, his voice wavered. The confidence he once displayed was gone, replaced by bitterness and anger. He denied, deflected, but the evidence was iron. The judge's gavel struck, silencing him. For the first time, Richard saw the fear in the man who had stolen his freedom. Justice, slow and unyielding, was finally catching up. The judge's words broke the air like a thunderclap. The charges against Richard were dismissed. The courtroom gasped, some rising to their feet in disbelief, others bowing their heads in silent regret. Richard's chains were unlocked, the cold metal falling away from his wrists with a finality that echoed louder than applause. His hands, scarred and weary, trembled as they were freed. He turned, eyes locking on the two who stood waiting. The children, no longer children, watched him with tears shining in their eyes. In that moment, the years of sacrifice, of hunger and toil, of ridicule and loneliness, crystallized into a truth too powerful to deny. His love had not been in vain. They had not only survived under his care, they had grown into the very shield he needed. As he stepped toward them, the crowd parted, silent now, humbled by the sight. The boy clasped Richard's arm firmly. The girl wrapped him in an embrace that carried every memory of warmth he had given her. Richard closed his eyes, letting the tears fall freely. He had been betrayed, humiliated, nearly destroyed, but love had come full circle. Outside the courthouse, the world felt different. The sun, hidden for weeks behind clouds of despair, shone brighter. Richard breathed in the air of freedom, each breath steady, alive. He was not leaving alone. He was walking forward with the two souls who had once been abandoned in an alley, but who now stood as his legacy. The community that had mocked him now looked on in silence, some with guilt, others with awe. Richard's head, once bowed under shame, lifted with a dignity no trial could take away. He was not just the man who saved two children. He was the man whose sacrifice had been redeemed by love. And as he walked away from the courthouse, his hands held tightly by the very ones he had once saved, Richard Green understood the truth that had carried him through every storm. Love never dies. It waits, it grows, and when the time comes, it rises to save you. If Richard's story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that sacrifice and love are never wasted. Subscribe now for more powerful stories where truth rises above lies and justice silences hate. And before you go, drop a comment below. Do you believe that love always finds a way to return? Because Richard Green's life proves one thing. What you give in love will one day come back to save you.